You know what's wild? Back in 2015, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson made us all collectively fear earthquakes in a way we never had before. San Andreas came out swinging, literally shaking up the disaster movie genre with its massive scale destruction and heart-pounding action sequences. I remember walking out of the theater thinking twice about visiting California, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't the only one. This film took the classic disaster movie formula and cranked it up to 11, combining cutting-edge visual effects with genuine human emotion. It's not every day you get to see Los Angeles and San Francisco basically crumble like sandcastles while following a father's desperate journey to save his family. The basic premise of San Andreas is actually terrifyingly simple, which is probably why it works so well. We're looking at a scenario where the San Andreas Fault, that infamous crack running through California, finally does what scientists have been warning about for decades. It doesn't just crack a little, it absolutely goes berserk. The film kicks off with seismologist Lawrence Hayes, played brilliantly by Paul Giamatti, who discovers a way to predict earthquakes. Talk about bad timing, right? Because just as he figures this out, the entire fault line decides to unleash the biggest earthquake in recorded history. We're talking a magnitude 9 point something that essentially rips California apart at the seams. The movie doesn't hold back on showing us what this would actually look like, from the initial tremors to the catastrophic main event that leaves major cities in ruins. What makes the premise particularly engaging is that it grounds this massive geological disaster in a very personal story about a rescue helicopter pilot trying to save his family against impossible odds. Now let's talk about our main characters, because honestly, they're what keep you invested when buildings are falling like dominoes. At the center of everything is Ray Gaines, played by Dwayne Johnson, who's a Los Angeles Fire Department rescue helicopter pilot. This guy's basically seen it all, pulled people from impossible situations, but nothing has prepared him for what's coming. Ray's got some serious emotional baggage he's carrying around, which the film reveals gradually. Then there's his soon-to-be ex-wife Emma, portrayed by Carla Gugino, and their daughter Blake, played by Alexandra Daddario. The family dynamic here is complicated, to say the least. Emma's moving on with a new boyfriend, Daniel Riddick, who's this wealthy real estate developer played by Iowan Grufford. Blake's caught in the middle of all this family drama, trying to be supportive while dealing with her own trauma. The film does a nice job of establishing these relationships before everything literally falls apart. You've also got Ben and Ollie Taylor, two brothers Blake meets during the disaster, played by Hugo Johnstone Burt and Art Parkinson. These kids become crucial to Blake's survival story, and their chemistry together feels genuine and unforced. Dwayne Johnson's role as Ray Gaines is probably one of his most emotionally nuanced performances, which might surprise people who think of him as just an action star. Sure, there's plenty of action. The man literally helicopter rescues his way through a crumbling California, but there's real depth here too. Ray's dealing with the loss of a daughter, which we learn about as the story unfolds, and it's this tragedy that's driven a wedge between him and Emma. Johnson brings this vulnerability to the character that makes you care about him beyond just his ability to navigate impossible situations. He's not playing an invincible superhero, he's playing a dad who failed to save one daughter and is absolutely determined not to lose another. The physical stuff Johnson does is insane, from piloting helicopters through collapsing buildings to parachuting into AT&T Park in San Francisco. But it's the quiet moments that really sell the character. When he talks about their lost daughter, you can see the pain in his eyes, and it grounds all the spectacular action in real human emotion. Carla Gugino, as Emma Gaines, brings her own strength to the role, and the film wisely doesn't make her just a damsel in distress waiting to be rescued. Emma's resourceful, capable, and when things go sideways, she handles herself remarkably well. The dynamic between Emma and Ray is interesting because you can tell they still love each other, but grief has pushed them apart. Gugino and Johnson have solid chemistry together, which makes their reunion feel earned rather than contrived. There's this moment early in the film where Ray comes to pick up their daughter, and you can see the awkwardness between them, the weight of everything unsaid. But as the disaster unfolds, and they're forced to work together, you see that partnership they once had come back to life. Emma's journey from preparing to move on with her life to fighting to survive and reunite with her daughter is compelling, and Gugino plays it with just the right amount of determination and fear. Blake Gaines, played by Alexandra Daddario, could have easily been written as just the helpless daughter who needs constant saving, but thankfully the script gives her more to do. Blake's got her own survivor's guilt from the accident that took her sister's life, and throughout the film, she proves she inherited her parents' courage and resourcefulness. When she gets separated from her folks and trapped in San Francisco just as the big one hits, she doesn't fall apart. Instead, she takes charge, uses the survival skills her dad taught her, and actually ends up helping save the people she's with. Daddario brings a nice balance of vulnerability and strength to the role. She's scared, which is completely reasonable when your city is literally sinking, but she doesn't let that fear paralyze her. The scenes where she's navigating the flooding financial district with Ben and Ollie show a young woman who's finding her courage in the worst possible circumstances. The film was directed by Brad Peyton, who previously worked with Dwayne Johnson on Journey 2, The Mysterious Island. Peyton's not necessarily a household name director, but what he does well here is balance the massive scale destruction with intimate human moments. It would be easy for a movie like this to become just a special effects showcase where you lose track of the characters amid all the chaos. But Peyton keeps the focus on the Gaines family even when skyscrapers are toppling. His background in visual effects serves him well here because he clearly understands how to frame these massive disaster sequences in ways that feel both spectacular and comprehensible. Some disaster movies get so chaotic you can't tell what's happening, but Peyton maintains clarity even when everything's shaking apart. He's also not afraid to let the camera linger on the emotional beats, giving the actors room to breathe between the action sequences. The pacing he achieves is pretty impressive, alternating between pulse-pounding disaster sequences and quieter character moments without losing momentum. The screenplay was written by Carlton Cuse, who's probably best known for his work on the television series Lost. He's joined by Andre Fabrizio and Jeremy Passmore, who share story credit. What Cuse brings to San Andreas is that character-driven storytelling he honed on Lost, making sure the spectacle serves the story rather than overwhelms it. The script wisely establishes the family drama before the earthquakes hit, so we're invested in these people before we start worrying about their physical survival. There are definitely some disaster movie cliches here: the estranged couple reuniting through catastrophe, the new boyfriend who turns out to be less than heroic, the scientist explaining what's happening, but the script handles them with enough sincerity that they work. The dialogue occasionally gets a bit on the nose, particularly some of the emotional declarations, but overall it does what it needs to do. It gives us characters worth rooting for and puts them in increasingly impossible situations where their choices matter. San Andreas was produced by Warner Brothers Pictures and New Line Cinema, with Beau Flynn serving as the main producer through his Flynn Picture Co. banner. Flynn had been developing this project for years, originally with a different cast and creative team. Dwayne Johnson came aboard as both star and producer through his Seven Bucks Productions company, alongside his longtime producing partner Danny Garcia. This production partnership would continue on several subsequent projects, establishing a solid working relationship. The budget for San Andreas was estimated at around $110 million, which in the realm of big-budget disaster films is actually relatively modest. Think about it. They had to destroy two major cities convincingly, and they did it for less than many superhero movies spend. That money clearly went on screen, though, because the effects work is genuinely impressive. The production involved extensive location shooting in California and Australia, with the latter standing in for various California locations. The Australian connection made sense given the tax incentives and the availability of skilled crews and facilities there. The inspiration for San Andreas comes from decades of scientific warnings about the real San Andreas Fault and what a major earthquake along it could do to California. The filmmakers consulted with seismologists and disaster preparedness experts to ground the scenario in at least some scientific reality, though they definitely took dramatic liberties. The idea was to create a worst-case scenario that, while unlikely in its specifics, represents real dangers that Californians live with every day. There's something inherently terrifying about a disaster that could actually happen versus aliens or monsters or whatever. Earthquakes are real, the San Andreas Fault is real, and while the likelihood of everything in the movie happening exactly as shown is slim, it's not impossible. That's what makes it scary. The filmmakers looked at historical earthquakes, particularly the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and more recent quakes, to inform their disaster sequences. They wanted to show not just buildings falling, but the cascading effects of such a catastrophe, the fires, the tsunamis, the panic, all of it. Supporting the main cast is a really solid group of actors who help flesh out this disaster scenario. Paul Giamatti plays Lawrence Hayes, a Caltech seismologist who's developed a method for predicting earthquakes using magnetic pulses. Giamatti brings his usual intensity to the role, making you believe this guy genuinely cares about warning people and saving lives. He's basically the voice of scientific authority throughout the film, explaining to the audience what's happening geologically while trying desperately to alert the public. Then you've got Archie Panjabi as Serena, a journalist who ends up stuck with Lawrence as the quakes hit. Their dynamic provides some of the film's lighter moments while also serving as our window into the bigger picture of what's happening across California. Iowan Grufford plays Daniel Riddick, Emma's new boyfriend, who starts off seeming like the perfect successful gentleman but shows his true colors when things get dangerous. Will Yoon Lee and Kylie Minogue have smaller roles that still make an impact, particularly Minogue's brief appearance as Daniel's sister, who gets caught in the initial Hoover Dam disaster. The young actors playing Ben and Ollie Taylor bring a lot of heart to their roles. Hugo Johnstone Burt, as Ben, creates this character who's smart, resourceful, and clearly develops feelings for Blake even as they're fighting to survive. He's a British tourist with his younger brother just trying to see San Francisco, and suddenly he's navigating a disaster zone. The relationship that develops between Ben and Blake feels natural, two young people finding connection in crisis. Art Parkinson, as the younger brother Ollie, is endearing without being annoying, which is a tough balance for a child actor. He provides some necessary levity, his wide-eyed reactions to the chaos around them reminding us how surreal this situation is, but he's also brave when it counts. The three of them together create a survival trio that you genuinely root for, their scenes providing necessary breaks from the main action while maintaining tension. The chemistry between the main actors is crucial to making San Andreas work, and fortunately, it's there. Dwayne Johnson and Carla Gugino feel like a couple with history. There's a lived-in quality to their interactions that sells the idea they've been together for years, raised a family, and suffered a tragedy together. When they look at each other, you can see both the love that's still there and the pain that's driven them apart. Their reunion isn't just about getting back together, it's about both of them finding a way to forgive themselves and each other for something that wasn't really anyone's fault. The banter between them, even in the midst of disaster, feels authentic. Alexandra Daddario holds her own in scenes with both of them, and the family dynamic feels genuine. You believe these are three people who love each other but have been broken by grief. The chemistry between Blake and the Taylor brothers is different but equally important. There's a sweetness to the developing romance between Blake and Ben that never overwhelms the survival story. They share glances, small moments of connection, but the film doesn't force it. Ollie acts as a bit of a buffer and comic relief, and the dynamic between the three of them feels like young people banding together in crisis. The actors listen to each other in their scenes, react naturally, and you get the sense they genuinely enjoyed working together. That authentic connection translates on screen and makes you care about whether they make it out alive. Now let's dive into what actually happens in this movie, because the plot moves at a pretty relentless pace once things get going. The film opens with a young woman driving through the San Gabriel Mountains when a minor earthquake triggers a landslide. Her car ends up dangling over a cliff, and this is where we meet Ray Gaines in action, executing a spectacular helicopter rescue that establishes both his skills and the film's commitment to practical stunts combined with effects. It's a great opening that shows us who Ray is and what he can do. Meanwhile, at Caltech, Lawrence Hayes and his team are testing a new earthquake prediction model at the Hoover Dam. They've figured out that they can detect magnetic pulses that occur right before a quake, potentially giving them warning time. Of course, just as they're celebrating this breakthrough, the dam starts to crack. The Hoover Dam sequence is our first major disaster set piece, and it's absolutely devastating, showing the raw power of what's to come. The personal drama kicks in as Ray prepares to drive Blake up to college, one last father-daughter trip before she heads off to school. But Emma asks if her new boyfriend Daniel can take Blake instead in his private plane since he's heading to San Francisco anyway. Ray reluctantly agrees, and you can see it hurts him to be replaced, even in this small way. Before Blake leaves, there's a touching scene where Ray gives her a going-away present, and they talk about her sister. It's clear that Blake's departure is bringing up all sorts of feelings about the daughter they lost. These quiet character moments are essential because they give weight to everything that follows. We need to care about this family before we can worry about their survival. Daniel seems like a decent enough guy at this point, successful, charming, trying to make a good impression, and Blake seems okay with her mom moving on, even if it's complicated. As Blake, Emma's boyfriend Daniel, and his colleague are driving through San Francisco, the earthquakes begin in earnest. What starts as minor tremors quickly escalates into a massive quake that tears through the city. This is where the film's effects really start to shine, buildings swaying and collapsing, the ground literally splitting open, cars tumbling through the streets. The sequence is chaotic and terrifying, and in the midst of it, Daniel's true nature is revealed. When he and Blake are in a parking garage and she gets her leg trapped in a car, Daniel panics. Instead of helping her, he abandons her and runs. It's a shocking moment that happens quickly, showing how crisis reveals character. Blake is left alone, injured, in a collapsing garage, and it's here that she meets Ben and Ollie Taylor. Ben, who's a student studying engineering at Cambridge, hears her calling for help and comes back for her when his own life would be easier if he just kept running. The contrast between Daniel and Ben couldn't be clearer. Meanwhile, Ray is in the air in his helicopter when the quake hits Los Angeles. He immediately tries to contact Blake and Emma, his training warring with his parental panic. When he can't reach Blake, he makes the controversial decision to divert from his official rescue duties to save his family. This choice is interesting because the film doesn't really dwell on the ethics of it. Ray's abandoning his post to pursue a personal mission while thousands need help, but you understand it. He's already lost one daughter. He cannot lose another. He finds Emma at a restaurant that's in the process of collapsing, and the sequence where he rescues her from a crumbling high-rise is absolutely spectacular. They're using a helicopter to pluck her off a building that's breaking apart, and the timing and choreography of the scene is intense. Once Emma's aboard, they set course for San Francisco to find Blake, flying over a Los Angeles that's barely recognizable, smoke and fires everywhere, freeways collapsed. It's apocalyptic. The journey from Los Angeles to San Francisco becomes an odyssey filled with obstacles. Ray and Emma's helicopter runs out of fuel, forcing them to make an emergency landing in Bakersfield. Here's where we get one of the film's more ridiculous but fun moments. Ray essentially commandeers a truck from a relief store by promising the owner they'll get his daughter to safety in San Francisco. The owner agrees because, hey, it's Dwayne Johnson asking, and they hit the road. But the earthquakes aren't done, not by a long shot. Lawrence Hayes realizes that the initial quakes were just foreshocks, that an even bigger earthquake is coming, and San Francisco is going to take the brunt of it. He goes on live television to warn people, urging evacuation, but of course, many people don't listen or can't get out in time. The film does a good job of cutting between Lawrence and Serena, trying to spread the warning, and Ray and Emma racing to reach their daughter before the big one hits. Back in San Francisco, Blake, Ben, and Ollie are trying to navigate a city that's already been heavily damaged and is about to get hit again. Blake's survival training kicks in, and she takes charge of their little group. They need to get to higher ground and find a way to signal for help. Blake remembers that her dad always told her to get to open ground during an earthquake, away from buildings that could collapse. They make their way through the chaos, helping others along the way, which shows Blake's character. She's not just focused on her own survival, she's helping people despite her own fear and injury. The dynamic between the three of them strengthens as they face each challenge. Ben's engineering knowledge comes in handy, and even young Ollie contributes, his smaller size allowing him to fit into spaces the others can't. They're a good team, and the film gives them genuine obstacles to overcome rather than just having them run from falling debris. Ray and Emma acquire a small plane from a relief center, with Emma piloting because she has her license. This leads to another spectacular sequence where they're flying into San Francisco just as the massive 9.6 magnitude quake hits. The Golden Gate Bridge, that iconic symbol of the city, basically tears itself apart while they're flying over it. It's a stunning visual effects sequence that must have taken months to create, the bridge twisting and sections falling into the bay. They managed to land the plane in the city. Though land might be generous, it's more of a controlled crash. They're on foot now in a San Francisco that's experiencing the worst earthquake in history. Buildings are coming down, there are fires everywhere, and then comes the tsunami. Because apparently a massive earthquake wasn't enough, the seismic activity triggers a huge tsunami that's going to flood the city. Lawrence predicts this and tries to warn people, but there's only so much you can do when a wall of water is bearing down on you. The tsunami sequence is where San Andreas really earns its disaster movie credentials. The wave comes surging through the Golden Gate Bridge, which is already damaged, and just swamps the city. Ray and Emma find a boat and literally surf the tsunami wave through the flooding streets of San Francisco. It's completely over the top and probably not remotely realistic, but it's also thrilling cinema. They're navigating around falling buildings, capsizing ships, and all manner of debris as they search for Blake. The film cuts between their desperate search and Blake's group, who have taken shelter in a building that's now flooding. They make their way higher in the building, but the water keeps rising. Blake realizes they need to signal her dad somehow, and she remembers that he'll be looking from the air, so they make their way to the highest point they can reach. Daniel, remember him, the boyfriend who abandoned Blake, makes his own appearance during this chaos. In what amounts to almost cosmic justice, we see him trying to push his way onto an evacuation boat, shoving other people aside in his desperation to save himself. The film doesn't spend much time on it, but you see him get his comeuppance when he's left behind as the tsunami hits. It's a small moment, but it reinforces the film's theme about character and courage. Meanwhile, Blake and the Taylor brothers find themselves trapped in a department store that's rapidly flooding. They make it to the top floor, but even that's not high enough. The water keeps rising, and they end up having to dive down into the flooded building to find a way out. This sequence is incredibly tense, shot mostly underwater with the characters running out of air as they search for an exit. Ben's hurt, making it harder, and Blake has to basically drag him while Ollie follows. They find a way to a higher section of the building just before they would have drowned, gasping for air in a small pocket of space. Ray and Emma's search seems hopeless as they navigate the flooded city. How do you find one person in all this chaos? But Ray refuses to give up, and this is where Dwayne Johnson really sells the character's desperation. He's calling out for Blake, searching every building, every debris pile, not willing to accept that he might be too late. Emma's equally determined, these two parents united in their singular goal. Then they spot it, a laser light cutting through the smoke and debris. Blake, remembering her father's lessons, has used a backup battery and a piece of glass to create a signal, shining the light into the sky. It's a small detail from earlier in the film paying off, Ray telling her that in a disaster, you signal for help, you make yourself visible. That laser beam guides them right to the building where Blake and the brothers are trapped. The rescue isn't simple, though, because nothing in this movie is simple. The building is unstable and mostly underwater. Ray has to dive down into the flooded structure to reach them, and when he finds the room where they've taken shelter, Blake is unconscious. They were in an air pocket, but it ran out, and Blake drowned. This is the emotional climax of the film, because Ray didn't lose his daughter in the earthquake. He's lost her to drowning after he got so close to saving her. He pulls her body out of the water and begins CPR, refusing to accept that she's gone. Emma joins him, both parents working to revive their daughter while Ben and Ollie watch helplessly. It's a powerful scene, Johnson and Gugino selling the raw panic and grief, and when Blake finally coughs up water and takes a breath, it's a genuinely emotional moment. The family is reunited, battered and traumatized, but alive. The film's climax has the family, now including Ben and Ollie, making their way to a refugee camp that's been set up in the ruins of the city. As they climb through the devastation, the sun comes up on a San Francisco that's barely recognizable. The visual of the ruined city in the morning light is sobering, a reminder of the scale of the disaster. At the camp, they find medical attention and safety. Lawrence Hayes is there too, having survived his own harrowing experiences, and there's a brief acknowledgement between him and Ray, two men who did what they could in an impossible situation. The film ends on a note of hope amidst the devastation. The American flag is raised over the ruins. Blake and Ben share a moment confirming what you've known throughout the film, that they're going to stick together, and Ray and Emma stand together, a family reunited and healing. It's not a subtle ending, but it works for the kind of movie this is. The visual style of San Andreas is big, bold, and unapologetically spectacular. Director Brad Peyton and cinematographer Steve Yedlin created a look that emphasizes the massive scale of the disaster while maintaining clarity in the action. The color palette shifts as the film progresses, starting with warm California sunshine in the early scenes and gradually becoming more muted and smoke-filled as the disaster unfolds. By the time we reach the tsunami sequence, there's this almost apocalyptic quality to the visuals, all grays and browns with occasional flashes of fire orange. Yedlin uses a lot of sweeping aerial shots to establish the geography and show the extent of the destruction, which helps orient the audience. You always know where the characters are in relation to the danger, which is crucial in a disaster film. The camera work during the action sequences is kinetic but not chaotic. There's enough movement to convey the energy and danger without becoming incomprehensible. The visual effects are really the star of the show technically, and they're pretty impressive. The team at Hydraulics, Scanline Vive FX, and other effects houses created destruction on a massive scale. What makes it work is that they combined practical effects with CGI, so you have real debris and water effects blended with digital buildings collapsing. The Hoover Dam sequence early in the film sets the tone, showing concrete crumbling and water bursting through in ways that feel weighty and real. The Los Angeles skyline collapsing has these iconic buildings we recognize being destroyed, which makes it personal in a weird way. But the San Francisco sequences are where the effects team really shows off. The Golden Gate Bridge destruction is a technical marvel, with the bridge twisting and breaking in ways that feel physically accurate even as they're spectacular. The tsunami was created using a combination of water tank photography, digital water simulations, and clever compositing. In the scenes where Ray and Emma are in the boat riding the wave, you can tell they're on a practical gimbal with water effects, but the surrounding destruction is digital, and the blend is seamless. Cinematographer Steve Yedlin, who's probably best known for his work with Rian Johnson on films like Looper and The Last Jedi, brings a more grounded aesthetic to San Andreas than you might expect. Despite all the spectacle, he lights scenes naturalistically, using motivated light sources even in the most chaotic moments. During the early scenes, there's warm California sunlight streaming through windows, giving everything this golden quality that makes the later destruction feel even more devastating. Once the earthquakes hit, the lighting becomes more fractured and dramatic, with sparks from broken electrical lines, fires, and emergency lights creating harsh contrasts. The underwater sequences are lit with this murky, oxygen-deprived quality that makes you feel claustrophobic. Yedlin also makes great use of the IMAX format, which the film was partially shot in. The aspect ratio shifts for the bigger action sequences give them added impact, literally filling more of the screen with destruction. The sound design and musical score deserve mention because they contribute enormously to the film's impact. Composer Andrew Lockington created a score that balances epic disaster movie bombast with more intimate emotional themes. There's a recurring musical motif associated with the Gaines family, particularly in scenes dealing with their lost daughter, that's genuinely moving. During the action sequences, the score knows when to amp up and when to pull back and let the sound effects do the work. Speaking of which, the sound design is incredible. Earthquakes are tricky to portray in film because the sound is as important as the visual, and San Andreas gets it right. There's this deep, rumbling bass that you feel in your chest, combined with the higher frequency sounds of concrete cracking and glass shattering. The Dolby Atmos mix makes full use of the surround sound field, with debris falling around you and the ground seeming to shake beneath your seat. In the quieter moments, The sound design creates this eerie quality, the settling of rubble, distant alarms, the small sounds that emphasize the scale of the silence after such chaos. San Andreas clocks in at 114 minutes, which is a pretty perfect length for this kind of film. It's long enough to develop the characters and show multiple disaster set pieces without feeling rushed, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. The pacing is tight, with very little fat on it. From the moment the Hoover Dam cracks, the film maintains a sense of urgency even during the quieter character moments. You could argue that some of the emotional beats could have been given more room to breathe, but in a disaster movie, you kind of want to keep moving. The first act takes its time establishing who these people are and what their relationships are, which pays off later when we care about their survival. The second act is basically non-stop disaster action as the earthquakes escalate, and the third act balances the search for Blake with the tsunami aftermath. The runtime feels earned rather than padded. When San Andreas hit theaters in May 2015, it was a solid commercial success, which seems to surprise some people who dismissed it as just another disaster movie. The film opened to about $54 million domestically, which was a strong start, and it showed good legs, ultimately grossing about $155 million in the U.S. But the real story was international box office, where the film absolutely exploded. Overseas audiences loved it, particularly in China, where it made over $100 million. The total worldwide gross ended up being around $474 million against that $110 million budget, making it a clear hit. Warner Bros. Was obviously happy with those numbers, and talk of a sequel began almost immediately. The film's success showed that there's still an appetite for old-school disaster movies when they're done with modern effects and a decent human story at the center. Critical reception was more mixed, which is pretty standard for this genre. San Andreas currently sits at around 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which means critics were basically split on whether it succeeded. The critical consensus praised the visual effects and the committed performances, particularly Dwayne Johnson's, but dinged the film for a formulaic script and scientific liberties. Some reviewers felt the film was a fun throwback to 90s disaster movies like Twister and Dante's Peak, while others thought it was too generic and predictable. The audience scores were notably higher than the critical ones, with viewers generally having a good time with the spectacle and finding the emotional story more engaging than critics did. It's worth noting that disaster movies have never been critical darlings. They're judged on entertainment value and technical achievement rather than script originality or thematic depth. By those metrics, San Andreas delivers. The film's strengths are pretty clear if you watch it with the right expectations. First and foremost, the disaster sequences are genuinely spectacular and impressively staged. They feel big and consequential, with real weight to the destruction. The Hoover Dam collapse, the Los Angeles earthquake, the Golden Gate Bridge destruction, and the tsunami are all memorable set pieces that deliver on the promise of the premise. Second, Dwayne Johnson gives a genuinely invested performance that grounds the spectacle in human emotion. He's not just running through the motions, he brings real vulnerability to Ray Gaines. The family dynamic works, and you care whether these people survive and reunite. Third, the film moves at a great pace and never gets boring. Even in the quieter moments, there's forward momentum. Fourth, the technical achievements in terms of effects, sound, and cinematography are top-notch. This is a big-budget blockbuster that looks and sounds like one, giving you your money's worth in terms of spectacle. The weaknesses are worth acknowledging too, because the film definitely has them. The script is pretty predictable, hitting all the expected disaster movie beats without much surprise. You can see most of the story turns coming, from Daniel revealing himself to be a coward to Ray and Emma reconciling to Blake, proving her resourcefulness. The scientific accuracy is questionable at best, with the film taking huge liberties with how earthquakes work for dramatic effect. Real seismologists have pointed out numerous issues with the scenario as presented, though the filmmakers did consult experts and then chose to ignore some of their advice for entertainment value. The supporting characters sometimes feel underdeveloped, particularly Daniel, who's basically just there to be a jerk and disappear. Some of the dialogue gets cheesy, especially during the emotional moments, though the actors sell it well enough that it mostly works. The film also doesn't really grapple with the moral complexity of Ray abandoning his official duties to save his family, which could have added interesting depth. These are valid criticisms, but they're also kind of par for the course with disaster movies. You're not watching San Andreas for nuanced character development and scientific accuracy. You're watching it for earthquakes destroying California and a father fighting to save his daughter. So is San Andreas worth watching? I'd say absolutely, if you go in with the right mindset. This isn't a film trying to be a profound meditation on disaster or human nature. It's a straightforward, well-executed disaster movie that delivers exactly what it promises. If you enjoy films like The Day After Tomorrow, 2012, or classic disaster flicks from the 70s and 90s, San Andreas fits right into that tradition while using modern technology to create more convincing destruction. It's a great movie for a night when you want something exciting and engaging that doesn't require deep analysis. The action is spectacular, the performances are committed, and despite its flaws, it has genuine heart. Dwayne Johnson fans will definitely enjoy seeing him in a role that lets him be both action hero and vulnerable father. If you're terrified of earthquakes, maybe skip it, or watch it as exposure therapy. I'm not a psychologist, but for most audiences, it's a fun, thrilling ride that earns its emotional moments even as it destroys iconic landmarks. One aspect that really helps San Andreas stand out from other disaster films is how it handles the family trauma at its core. The backstory about Ray and Emma's other daughter, who drowned in a rafting accident, adds real weight to everything that happens. It's not just mentioned once and forgotten, it informs every decision Ray makes and explains why he's so driven to save Blake. The guilt he carries about not being able to save his older daughter, even though he's a professional rescue worker, creates this internal conflict that makes his journey more than just physical survival. When Blake ends up drowning and Ray has to perform CPR, it's not just a tense rescue moment, it's him facing his worst nightmare again. The fact that this time he succeeds, that this time he's there and he saves her, provides a catharsis that the film has been building toward. It's surprisingly sophisticated emotional storytelling for a movie where The Rock rides a tsunami. The relationship between Blake and the Taylor brothers also provides some nice texture to the survival story. Ben's immediate decision to help Blake when she's trapped, despite not knowing her and putting himself at risk, establishes him as a genuinely good person. Throughout their ordeal, he never tries to take advantage of the situation or act like Blake owes him anything. He just helps because it's the right thing to do. The little romance that develops between them feels earned because it's built on mutual respect and shared trauma. They've been through something intense together, and that creates a bond. Ollie's presence keeps things from getting too heavy, his youthful optimism and occasional comic relief providing necessary breathing room. The three of them together represent a younger generation that's capable and resourceful, not just victims waiting to be saved. Blake particularly embodies this, using the skills her father taught her to keep them all alive. What's interesting about the film's portrayal of disaster is that it shows both the best and worst of human nature. You've got Daniel abandoning Blake to save himself, people panicking and trampling each other to reach safety, looters taking advantage of the chaos. But you also see ordinary people helping each other, rescue workers risking their lives, strangers working together to survive. Ray and Emma encounter people throughout their journey who help them despite having their own problems, like the guy who gives them his truck. Ben chooses to help Blake when he could have just kept running. Even in the refugee camps at the end, you see people organizing, providing medical care, trying to rebuild. The film doesn't shy away from showing that disasters bring out selfishness in some people, but it ultimately comes down on the side of human resilience and compassion. That optimistic view of humanity is part of what makes the ending work, despite the massive devastation we've witnessed. The science in San Andreas is definitely Hollywood science rather than real science, and it's worth talking about what the film gets wrong because it's a lot. Real seismologists were pretty vocal after the film's release about the inaccuracies. For starters, the San Andreas Fault is a strike-slip fault, meaning the plates slide past each other horizontally rather than one going up and one going down. This type of fault doesn't typically generate tsunamis because there's no vertical displacement of water. The film's tsunami is pure dramatic license. The magnitude 9.6 earthquake shown would be extremely unlikely on the San Andreas Fault, which has a realistic maximum around 8.3. The idea that you could predict earthquakes by detecting magnetic pulses is currently science fiction. We still can't reliably predict earthquakes with any precision. The notion that the entire fault would rupture at once from south to north is also not how it typically works. Buildings in California are built to modern seismic codes and would likely perform better than shown in the film, though a truly massive quake would certainly cause significant damage. The Hoover Dam, while it could theoretically be damaged by an earthquake, probably wouldn't fail quite as catastrophically as depicted. But here's the thing, the filmmakers knew all this. They consulted with experts, learned the real science, and then made conscious decisions to exaggerate and dramatize for entertainment value. This is disaster movie tradition going back decades. The question isn't whether San Andreas is scientifically accurate, it's whether the dramatic liberties it takes serve the story and create compelling cinema. I'd argue they do, even if geology professors might cringe. The film did include some genuine safety information, like the advice to get to open ground during a quake and to signal for help, which could actually be useful. So maybe it balances out, probably not, but it's a nice thought. The character of Lawrence Hayes, played by Paul Giamatti, serves as the film's scientific voice and provides crucial exposition about what's happening geologically. Giamatti brings his typical intensity to the role, making Lawrence a passionate scientist who's frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles and desperate to warn people about the impending disaster. His relationship with Serena the journalist gives him someone to explain things to, which is a classic screenwriting technique for delivering information to the audience. Their scenes together, racing to stay ahead of the disaster while trying to broadcast warnings, add a different dimension to the film beyond the Gaines family story. Lawrence represents the people trying to understand and predict natural disasters, working to give populations advance warning even when the politicians and officials don't want to cause panic. His arc is less personal than Ray's, but still satisfying. He proves his earthquake prediction method works, even though it comes too late to prevent massive loss of life. And by the end, he's become a public figure who helped save those who heeded his warnings. The film's depiction of Los Angeles and San Francisco being destroyed taps into some deep-seated fears that Californians live with every day. Anyone who spent time in California knows that earthquakes are just part of life there. You feel minor tremors semi-regularly, and there's always this background awareness that the big one could happen someday. San Andreas takes that anxiety and cranks it up to 11, showing the nightmare scenario that people joke about but secretly worry about. The destruction of iconic landmarks like the Hollywood sign, the Golden Gate Bridge, AT&T Park, and various downtown skyscrapers makes it feel more real because these are places we recognize. When you've walked across the Golden Gate Bridge or driven on the highways shown crumbling in the film, it hits differently. The filmmakers definitely knew this and chose their destruction set pieces specifically for maximum impact. Watching Coit Tower tumble or seeing the Transamerica Pyramid damaged creates visceral reactions because these structures feel permanent, and seeing them fall reminds us that nothing really is. The practical effects work in San Andreas deserves more credit than it sometimes gets. While the large-scale destruction is obviously digital, many of the close-up disaster moments used practical effects, real debris falling, water tanks, shaking platforms, all the traditional movie magic that makes action feel tangible. When Ray and Emma are in the helicopter and you see them getting thrown around, that's real stunt work on a gimbal rig, not just actors in front of a green screen. The sequence where Emma is trapped in the collapsing restaurant involved a set that was actually rigged to break apart in controlled ways, with real dust and debris. Alexandra Daddario spent a lot of time in water tanks filming the flooding sequences, and while the water itself was real, the surrounding destruction was added digitally later. This combination of practical and digital effects is what makes the action feel grounded even when it's completely over the top. Your brain can tell the difference between an actor reacting to something real versus reacting to nothing, and San Andreas uses enough practical elements to keep the performances feeling authentic. Dwayne Johnson did many of his own stunts in the film, which shouldn't surprise anyone who's followed his career. The man is a legitimate athlete who takes the physical side of his roles seriously. For the helicopter sequences, he trained with actual rescue helicopter pilots to understand the equipment and procedures. Obviously, he wasn't actually flying during the action scenes, but he learned enough to make his actions look credible. The parachute jump into San Francisco involved him doing actual skydiving training, though the specific shot in the film combined real skydiving footage with digital backgrounds. For the scenes on the boat riding the tsunami, he was on a practical gimbal rig getting soaked with fire hoses while the boat pitched and rolled. It's the kind of commitment to the physical reality of a scene that makes Johnson such a compelling action star. He's not just relying on stunt doubles and CGI, he's genuinely there getting thrown around and drenched, which brings an authenticity to the action. The film's use of real California locations mixed with Australian locations standing in for California creates an interesting visual blend. Some of the Los Angeles scenes were actually shot in LA, while others were filmed in Queensland, Australia, using a combination of practical sets and digital extensions. San Francisco was similarly a mix of location shooting in the actual city and work in Australia. The production built partial sets of various California locations on sound stages in Australia where they could control the environment and rig destruction effects safely. Then they'd blend this with establishing shots from the real locations and digital environments to create a seamless whole. This approach allowed them to destroy California convincingly without actually destroying California, which residents probably appreciate. The attention to detail in recreating the look and feel of these cities is impressive. Even if you know some of it was shot half a world away, it still feels authentically Californian. One of the film's smartest decisions was keeping the focus on a relatively small group of characters rather than trying to juggle a huge ensemble cast like some disaster movies do. Films like The Towering Inferno, or more recently 2012, have these sprawling casts with multiple storylines, and while that can work, It often leads to characters feeling underdeveloped because there's not enough screen time to go around. San Andreas primarily follows the Gaines family, with the Lawrence and Serena subplot providing context, and that's it. This streamlined approach means we spend enough time with Ray, Emma, and Blake to actually care about them as people rather than just disaster movie archetypes. We understand their relationships, their history, what they're fighting for beyond just survival. The emotional beats land better because we've invested in these specific characters. Even Ben and Ollie, who are supporting players, feel like real people rather than just obstacles or helpers for the main characters. The film's ending at the refugee camp is deliberately hopeful, showing people coming together in the aftermath of catastrophe to help each other and begin rebuilding. It's a classic disaster movie ending that emphasizes human resilience, and while some might find it a bit schmaltzy, it works emotionally after everything we've witnessed. The image of the American flag being raised over the ruins is an obvious patriotic symbol, but in context, it represents people refusing to give up, asserting that they'll rebuild and recover. The Gaines family standing together, having survived and reunited, provides the personal emotional closure, while the wider shots of the camp provide the societal one. Blake and Ben's connection suggests hope for the future, young people who've been through trauma but found each other. Ray and Emma's reconciliation feels earned because they've literally been through hell together and come out the other side. The film doesn't show the long, difficult process of rebuilding that would actually follow such a disaster, but that's not really what disaster movies are about. They're about surviving the event itself. There was talk of a sequel almost immediately after San Andreas's box office success, and for years it seemed like it was happening. Dwayne Johnson confirmed his involvement, Brad Peyton was set to return as director, and there were reports of the sequel potentially involving the Ring of Fire, expanding the disaster beyond just California to other Pacific regions. The project was tentatively titled San Andreas, The Rift, or San Andreas 2, depending on which reports you believed. However, as of now, the sequel remains in development limbo. Johnson's schedule became increasingly packed with Fast and Furious films, Jumanji sequels, and various other projects. The pandemic also disrupted Hollywood production schedules across the board. Whether we'll actually see San Andreas 2 remains uncertain, though given the first film's success and Johnson's continued box office appeal, it wouldn't be surprising if it eventually happens. The question is whether they can recapture what made the first film work, while finding a new disaster scenario that feels fresh, rather than just repeating the same beats. The impact San Andreas had on the disaster movie genre is interesting to consider. It came out at a time when disaster films had been relatively quiet. There hadn't been a major earthquake disaster movie in years. Its success showed studios that there was still an audience for these kinds of films when done with modern effects and a solid emotional core. In the years since, we've seen more disaster films greenlit, though not necessarily earthquake-focused. The film's blend of practical and digital effects became a template that other action and disaster films followed. Its success also solidified Dwayne Johnson's position as one of the few genuine movie stars who can open a film based largely on his presence. The fact that San Andreas made nearly $500 million worldwide, despite not being based on existing IP or being part of a franchise, is actually pretty remarkable in today's Hollywood landscape. From a technical standpoint, San Andreas pushed visual effects boundaries in terms of large-scale destruction, particularly with the water simulations for the tsunami sequence. Creating convincing digital water has long been one of the hardest challenges in visual effects, and the team on San Andreas developed new techniques for simulating the massive wave moving through the city, interacting with buildings and debris in realistic ways. These technical innovations ended up being used in subsequent films that needed large-scale water effects. The bridge destruction sequence required developing new methods for fracturing and breaking large structures in ways that looked physically accurate, considering factors like material stress and structural integrity. While audiences might not consciously notice these technical achievements, they contribute to the overall believability of the destruction, making the impossible feel possible. The sound design team faced unique challenges in creating an audio landscape for an earthquake disaster. Unlike explosions or gunfire, which have clear, sharp audio signatures, earthquakes produce complex, layering sounds that operate across a huge frequency range. There's the deep, subsonic rumbling that you feel more than hear, the mid-range cracking and grinding of concrete and metal, and the high-frequency sounds of glass shattering and debris falling. Creating an audio environment that captures all of this while remaining clear enough for dialogue and not becoming a muddy mess requires careful mixing and creative sound design. The team recorded actual earthquake sounds where possible and created custom sound effects for elements that don't exist in real life, like skyscrapers collapsing in specific ways. In a properly equipped theater, the sound design is almost as impressive as the visuals, creating a fully immersive disaster experience. Andrew Lockington's musical score does important work in San Andreas, though film scores often go underappreciated. A disaster movie score has to balance several competing needs. It needs epic, bombastic moments for the action sequences, emotional themes for the character beats, and it needs to know when to get out of the way and let the sound effects and visuals speak for themselves. Lockington created distinct musical themes for different elements of the film. There's a family theme that appears during the emotional moments, a disaster theme that underscores the destruction sequences, and action motifs for the rescue scenes. The score uses a full orchestra with heavy brass and percussion for the big moments, but scales back to intimate piano or strings for the quieter character scenes. During the climax, where Ray is trying to revive Blake, the music pulls back almost entirely, letting the emotion of the performances carry the scene before swelling back in when she gasps back to life. It's effective, manipulative in the best way that film scores should be. The film's approach to showing casualties is worth noting because it's actually quite restrained compared to what it could have shown. While we see buildings collapsing and understand that thousands of people are presumably dying, the film doesn't dwell on graphic images of suffering. We see people in peril and some people not making it, but it's handled in a way that maintains the PG-13 rating and doesn't become gratuitously dark. This is partly a commercial decision. They wanted the film to be accessible to as wide an audience as possible, but it also keeps the focus on the Gaines family's story rather than becoming disaster misery watching. The destruction is spectacular, but not mean-spirited, if that makes sense. The film is more interested in showing the heroism of people like Ray and the resilience of survivors than in wallowing in the tragedy. Some disaster films use human suffering as a spectacle in itself, but San Andreas generally avoids that trap. The marketing campaign for San Andreas was pretty clever, focusing heavily on Dwayne Johnson's star power and the spectacular destruction sequences. The trailers prominently featured the Hoover Dam collapse, the Golden Gate Bridge breaking apart, and the tsunami hitting San Francisco, essentially promising audiences the kind of large-scale disaster spectacle that you can only get in a theater. Johnson was heavily involved in promoting the film, using his massive social media presence to build hype and connect with potential audiences. The marketing leaned into the tagline, "A perfect disaster," positioning the film as the ultimate earthquake movie. They timed the release for early summer, getting out ahead of the more crowded late summer blockbuster season while still being positioned as a big event film. The strategy worked. as the opening weekend numbers proved that audiences were hungry for this kind of disaster spectacle, especially with a star they trusted to deliver entertainment. International marketing was particularly important for San Andreas, and the film's distributors tailored their approaches for different markets. In China, which ended up being the film's biggest international market, they emphasized the spectacle and scale of the disaster sequences while also highlighting the family drama elements that tend to resonate with Chinese audiences. In Europe, the marketing played up the technical achievements and the prestige of the effects work. In Latin America, Dwayne Johnson's personal popularity helped drive interest. The film's relatively straightforward premise, family tries to survive massive earthquake, translated easily across cultural barriers, unlike some Hollywood films with more culturally specific concepts. The universal themes of family, survival, and resilience resonated globally, which is a big part of why the film succeeded so strongly in international markets. Looking at San Andreas in the context of Dwayne Johnson's career, it represents an interesting middle chapter. By 2015, he'd already transitioned from WWE star to legitimate movie star, but he was still taking a variety of roles and hadn't yet settled into the specific brand he'd become known for in later films. San Andreas came between Fast and Furious entries and before the Jumanji reboot, at a time when he was proving he could carry a big-budget film as the solo lead. The role of Ray Gaines required him to balance action hero physicality with genuine emotional vulnerability, showing range that some of his earlier roles hadn't demanded. His performance in San Andreas likely contributed to him being taken more seriously as an actor beyond just his action credentials, even though the film itself is absolutely an action spectacle. You can see him really committing to the emotional scenes, particularly anything involving his lost daughter or Blake's near ending, in ways that elevate the material. Carla Gugino's casting as Emma was a smart choice because she brings credibility to what could have been a thankless role. Gugino has always been an underrated actress who elevates everything she's in, and Emma could have easily been written as just the worried wife character. Instead, Gugino gives her agency and capability, making Emma a partner in the survival mission, rather than just someone who needs protecting. The scene where she's piloting the plane into San Francisco showcases this. She's got skills and resourcefulness of her own. Gugino and Johnson developed a good rapport during filming that translates on screen as a believable relationship with history. You buy that these two people built a life together, lost a child together, and are finding their way back to each other through this crisis. The chemistry between them makes the reconciliation storyline work, even though it's following a pretty standard disaster movie template. Alexandra Daddario's career got a significant boost from San Andreas, even though she'd been working steadily before it. The role of Blake allowed her to show both vulnerability and toughness, and she became a favorite among audiences for her performance. The fact that Blake isn't just sitting around waiting to be rescued but actively problem-solving and helping others survive made the character more interesting and gave Daddario more to work with as an actress. Her underwater scenes required real physical commitment, holding her breath for extended periods and doing multiple takes in difficult conditions. The drowning and resurrection sequence is genuinely affecting, and Daddario sells both the peaceful unconsciousness and the gasping return to life convincingly. After San Andreas, she went on to bigger roles, including the Baywatch reboot and the Percy Jackson series, but this film was definitely a career stepping stone that showcased her capabilities to a wide audience. The choice to cast Hugo Johnstone Burt and Art Parkinson as the Taylor brothers brought fresh faces to the film and created an interesting dynamic. Johnstone Burt, an Australian actor, brings a kind of earnest likability to Ben that makes you root for him immediately. His character could have been just the generic love interest, but the script and his performance give Ben his own heroic moments and skills that contribute to the group's survival. The engineering knowledge he has becomes useful in practical ways, and his developing relationship with Blake feels organic rather than forced. Art Parkinson, who is already known for playing Rickon Stark in Game of Thrones, brings youthful energy to Ollie without making him annoying or unrealistic. The kid is scared but brave, smart but still childlike, and he provides some lighter moments without undercutting the danger. The three young actors together created a believable friendship forged in crisis. Paul Giamatti's presence in San Andreas adds a level of prestige to the proceedings because he's a highly respected actor not typically associated with big blockbuster disaster films. His decision to take the role of Lawrence Hayes was probably partially about wanting to be in a big crowd-pleasing movie, something different from the indie dramas and character pieces he's usually known for. Giamatti brings his signature intensity to the scientist role, making Lawrence's passion for his work and frustration with bureaucratic obstacles feel genuine. The scenes where he's warning people about the impending bigger quake and not being taken seriously tap into real-world frustration scientists face when trying to communicate dangers to the public and policymakers. Giamatti's performance grounds the more technical, expository scenes and makes the science, however Hollywoodized, feel more credible because it's coming from him. Ewan Grufford's Daniel Riddick serves as the film's moral counterpoint, showing how crisis reveals character. Grufford, a talented Welsh actor known for more sympathetic roles, plays Daniel as initially charming and successful, the kind of guy who looks perfect on paper. The turn when he abandons Blake is shocking precisely because Grufford had made him seem like a decent person up to that point. Some actors might have telegraphed the character's cowardice earlier, but Grufford plays it straight, making Daniel's betrayal land harder. It's a relatively small role in terms of screen time, but it's important to the film's thematic exploration of courage and character. Daniel represents taking the easy path, saving yourself at others' expense, which is contrasted with pretty much every other major character who chooses the harder path of helping others. The stunt work in San Andreas involved coordinating massive set pieces with hundreds of stunt performers and extras. The sequence at the Hoover Dam alone required dozens of stunt people performing falls, being hit by water, and navigating the collapsing structure. The Los Angeles earthquake scenes involved stunt drivers flipping cars and navigating crumbling streets, with choreography that had to be precisely timed to match with the digital effects being added later. The helicopter rescue sequences required stunt coordination between aerial work and performers on wires pretending to be dangling from buildings. The production employed some of the industry's top stunt coordinators and teams to pull off these complex sequences safely while making them look dangerous and chaotic. The commitment to doing as much practically as possible, with digital effects enhancing rather than replacing the stunt work, gives the action a weight and authenticity that purely CGI sequences often lack. Location scouting for San Andreas was an interesting process because the production needed to find places that could double for California while offering production advantages. Australia won out for many sequences because of generous tax incentives, skilled crews, excellent facilities, and the ability to build large sets without the restrictions they might face in actual California cities. However, the production did shoot establishing footage and some scenes in the real Los Angeles and San Francisco to capture the authentic look and feel of those cities. The aerial photography of California's landmarks was crucial for grounding the film in a recognizable reality before the destruction begins. The blend of Australian locations dressed to look like California, and real California footage is seamless enough that most audiences probably couldn't tell what was shot where, which is the point of good location work. The film's production design, overseen by Barry Chusid, involved creating numerous sets that could be safely destroyed during filming. The collapsing restaurant where Emma gets trapped was a practical set built on gimbals that could shake and break apart in controlled ways. The department store where Blake and the brothers take shelter was a combination of a practical set for the close-ups and a digital environment for the wider shot showing the flooding. The various helicopter interiors were practical sets that could be mounted on motion platforms to simulate flight and the chaos of flying through an earthquake. Chusid and his team had to design everything twice, once as it appears normally, and again as it would look destroyed, thinking through how materials would break and what the progression of destruction would look like. This level of detail contributes to the believability of the disaster sequences. The costume design by Wendy Chuck might not seem crucial in a disaster movie, but it actually plays an important role in characterization and practical storytelling. Ray's LA Fire Department uniform immediately identifies him as a rescuer and authority figure, while also showing wear and damage as the film progresses, tracking his physical journey. Emma's costume evolution from put-together woman having lunch to disaster survivor covered in dust and grime charts her journey visually. Blake starts out in typical young woman clothing but ends up soaking wet and disheveled, with her costumes becoming increasingly practical as she takes charge of her survival. The Taylor brothers' tourist clothing immediately marks them as outsiders caught in a disaster that isn't even in their home country. The costumes get progressively more damaged and dirty as the film goes on, something that seems obvious but requires careful continuity tracking since films aren't shot in chronological order. The editing by Bob Duxay faced the challenge of maintaining clarity during complex action sequences while keeping the pace brisk. Disaster movies can sometimes become visually confusing with too much chaos on screen and cuts that are too quick to follow. Duxay strikes a balance, using quick cuts during the most intense moments, but holding shots long enough to let you process what's happening spatially. The intercutting between Ray and Emma's journey and Blake's survival storyline is handled well, building tension by showing us both groups facing challenges simultaneously. The pacing keeps you engaged without feeling rushed, giving breathing room after major action sequences before ramping up again. The film's emotional beats are given time to land, with the editing not being afraid to hold on actors' faces during key moments. The climax, where Blake is revived, uses editing to build tension, intercutting between Ray's desperate CPR attempts, Emma's anguish, and Blake's unconsciousness, before finally releasing the tension when she breathes again. San Andreas succeeds largely because it understands what kind of movie it is and commits fully to that. It's not trying to be a profound examination of disaster response or a scientifically rigorous exploration of seismology. It's a big, entertaining disaster movie with heart, and it delivers on that premise extremely well. The spectacle is spectacular, the emotions are genuine even if sometimes manipulative, and the whole thing moves with enough energy that you're carried along for the ride. In an era where so many blockbusters are part of interconnected universes or based on existing franchises, there's something refreshing about a standalone disaster movie that tells a complete story in one film. You don't need to have seen previous installments or stick around for post-credits scenes. You just get a satisfying beginning, middle, and end in under 2 hours. For viewers who enjoy disaster movies as a genre, San Andreas is essential viewing because it represents the modern version done right. It learns from both classic disaster films and more recent entries, taking the spectacle and scale that modern effects allow while remembering that audiences need characters to care about amid all the destruction. If you're the type of person who gets excited about seeing massive destruction in movies, who enjoys the what-if scenarios of extreme disasters, and who appreciates a good father-daughter story, this film delivers on all counts. It's rewatchable too, the kind of movie you can throw on when you want something exciting that doesn't require too much mental energy, but still engages you emotionally. The effects hold up well even years later, which isn't always the case with effects-heavy films where the technology dates quickly. If you've never been in an earthquake, San Andreas might give you a tiny taste of what that experience feels like, though obviously amplified to catastrophic levels. If you have experienced earthquakes, you might find yourself alternately nodding at things the film gets right about the feeling of the ground moving beneath you and laughing at the absurd exaggeration. Either way, the film taps into that primal fear of the earth itself turning against you, of the solid ground that's supposed to be stable suddenly becoming unreliable. It's a different kind of disaster than a storm or a fire because you can't see it coming and you can't outrun it. You can only react and try to survive. That helplessness in the face of natural forces is what makes earthquake movies particularly unnerving when done well. The legacy of San Andreas in disaster movie history is still being written, but it's likely to be remembered as one of the better examples of modern disaster cinema. It revitalized interest in the earthquake disaster subgenre and proved that audiences still wanted these kinds of films when executed with technical skill and emotional investment. Future disaster movies will probably be compared to it, and filmmakers will study how it balanced spectacle with character, how it used effects to serve story rather than replace it, and how it maintained coherent geography and spatial relationships even during chaotic sequences. Whether or not the sequel ever materializes, the original San Andreas stands on its own as a thoroughly entertaining disaster spectacle with surprising amounts of heart. It's the kind of movie that reminds you why we go to theaters in the first place, to see things we can't experience in real life, to feel big emotions safely, and to be entertained by skilled craftspeople working at the top of their game. And honestly, watching the Rock helicopter rescue his way across a crumbling California while earthquakes tear everything apart, that's just fun cinema. And sometimes that's exactly what you need. Looking back at disaster films throughout cinema history, San Andreas fits into a long tradition that dates back to the 1970s when the genre really exploded with films like The Poseidon Adventure, The Towering Inferno, and Earthquake. Those classic disaster movies established the template that San Andreas follows: ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, personal dramas playing out against catastrophic events, and ensemble casts of characters fighting for survival. What's interesting is how the genre evolved over the decades. The 90s brought a resurgence with films like Twister, Volcano, and Dante's Peak, which started incorporating more advanced special effects. Then the 2000s gave us Roland Emmerich's mega disasters in The Day After Tomorrow and 2012, which took the destruction to global scale. San Andreas sits comfortably in this lineage, using 2015 technology to create destruction that would have been impossible to show convincingly even a decade earlier, while remembering that the human stories are what give the spectacle meaning. The film's approach to family trauma and healing through shared adversity is actually more sophisticated than it might initially appear. The Gaines family isn't just dealing with a divorce, they're dealing with unresolved grief over a lost child that has poisoned their ability to communicate and stay connected. Ray has buried himself in work, becoming the hero who saves everyone except his own family. Emma has tried to move forward by finding someone new, attempting to build a different life. Blake is caught between them, loving both parents but unable to fix what's broken between them. The earthquake, as terrible as it is, forces them to confront what they've been avoiding. Ray has to face his fear of failing to save someone he loves again. Emma has to acknowledge that she never stopped loving Ray and that moving on was just avoidance. Blake has to stop trying to be okay with everything and demand that her parents deal with their issues. The disaster becomes a crucible that burns away all the avoidance and pretense, leaving only what's real and essential. What makes Ray's character arc work is that he's not just physically brave, he's emotionally brave in ways that are harder. Flying a helicopter through collapsing buildings takes guts, sure, but so does admitting you've failed, that you couldn't save your daughter, that your marriage fell apart because you couldn't face your grief together. Johnson plays these moments with a raw honesty that might surprise people who think of him as just an action star. There's a scene early on where he's looking at old family photos, and you can see the pain in his face without any dialogue needed. Later, when he's talking to Emma in the helicopter about their lost daughter, his voice breaks in a way that feels completely genuine. These small moments of vulnerability make his heroics feel earned rather than just expected. Of course, he's going to pull off impossible rescues. He's the Rock. But the film makes you understand why it matters so much to him, what he's really fighting for beyond just survival. Emma's journey is equally important, even if it gets less screen time and focus. She's a woman who lost a child and watched her marriage crumble in the aftermath, who tried to put the pieces of her life back together with someone new, only to have everything literally fall apart around her. Gugino brings a weariness to the early scenes. You can tell Emma is going through the motions of moving on without really having healed. When Ray shows up to pick up Blake, the forced pleasantness between them barely covers the awkwardness and pain underneath. But as the disaster unfolds and Emma is forced to rely on Ray again, you see her remember why she fell in love with him in the first place. He's competent, brave, and completely focused on saving their daughter. The scene where they're working together in the helicopter, Emma navigating while Ray pilots, shows them falling back into an old rhythm, a partnership that still works when they let it. Her choice at the end to stay with Ray isn't just about romance, it's about choosing to face their grief together rather than running from it separately. Blake's character development is particularly well handled because she goes from being somewhat passive in her own life to actively taking charge. At the beginning, she's going along with what her parents want, being supportive of her mom's new relationship even though it clearly bothers her, accepting being shipped off to college when you sense she's not really ready. She's a young woman who spent years trying to be okay so her parents don't have to worry about her on top of everything else. But when she's trapped and injured and Daniel abandons her, something switches. She can't rely on anyone else to save her, so she saves herself. Throughout the rest of the film, Blake makes decisions, takes risks, and uses skills her father taught her that she probably learned just to make him happy, but now mean the difference between life and death. By the time Ray finds her, she's not the girl who left Los Angeles. She's someone who's discovered her own strength and capability. The drowning and resuscitation scene is almost like a rebirth. She literally dies and comes back. And when she does, she's fully herself in a way she wasn't before. The relationship between Blake and Ben develops naturally through shared crisis, which is a classic storytelling device but effective when done well. They meet in the worst possible circumstances. Blake is injured and trapped. Ben could save himself but chooses to help a stranger instead. And that choice tells you everything about his character. As they navigate the disaster together, They learn to trust each other quickly because they have to. There's no time for the usual getting-to-know-you dance. It's just immediate mutual reliance. The attraction between them grows organically from that trust and partnership. Ben's engineering background makes him useful in practical ways, figuring out structural problems and how to navigate dangerous spaces. Blake's survival training from her father kicks in at crucial moments. They complement each other, and you genuinely believe they'd want to stay in each other's lives after this experience. The film wisely doesn't overplay the romance. There are meaningful looks and a few tender moments, but mostly they're focused on survival. The payoff at the end, where they find each other in the refugee camp and share a real moment of connection, feels earned because we've watched them go through hell together. Young Ollie serves multiple purposes in the narrative beyond just being Ben's little brother. First, he's the innocent who needs protecting, raising the stakes for Blake and Ben's decisions. Second, he provides occasional comic relief without being obnoxious about it, his youthful perspective offering moments of levity that keep the film from becoming relentlessly grim. Third, he represents hope and resilience, this kid who stays relatively upbeat and brave even when everything's falling apart. Art Parkinson plays him with just the right balance of kid-like reactions and surprising maturity. When Ollie contributes to their survival with his own ideas or by squeezing into small spaces, it feels natural rather than contrived. The bond that forms between him and Blake has almost a big sister quality to it, and you sense that these three people are going to remain connected by what they've been through. The Paul Giamatti and Archie Punjabi storyline provides necessary context about what's happening scientifically and gives us a wider view of the disaster beyond just the Gaines family. Lawrence and Serena's journey from Caltech through the earthquakes, trying to warn people and document what's happening, adds scope to the narrative. Giamatti's passionate scientist frustrated by bureaucracy is a character type we've seen before, but he brings enough intensity and specificity to make Lawrence memorable. The scene where he's trying to convince officials to take the threat seriously and being dismissed has real-world resonance for anyone who's watched actual scientists struggle to communicate urgent information to skeptical politicians and public. When Lawrence goes on live TV to warn people about the incoming bigger quake, knowing his career might be over if he's wrong but unable to stay silent, it's a genuinely heroic moment of a different kind than Ray's physical heroics. Archie Punjabi's Serena is the audience surrogate in many ways, the person asking the questions we'd ask and reacting how we might react. She's a journalist who suddenly finds herself in the middle of the biggest story of her career, but also fighting for her life. The relationship that develops between her and Lawrence is professional camaraderie rather than romantic, which is refreshing. They're two professionals trying to do their jobs under impossible circumstances, and they develop mutual respect and even friendship through shared danger. Punjabi brings intelligence and strength to the role, making Serena more than just someone for Lawrence to explain things to. She asks smart questions, makes her own observations, and contributes to their survival with her own skills and resourcefulness. The film's pacing deserves more analysis because it's tricky to maintain momentum over nearly 2 hours when your story is essentially one long crisis. The screenplay and editing work together to create a rhythm of tension and release, big action sequences followed by quieter character moments, then building back up to the next disaster beat. The first act takes its time establishing the characters and their relationships before the Hoover Dam sequence kicks things into high gear. Once the earthquakes start, the film maintains urgency while still giving us breathing room. We'll have an intense sequence of Ray rescuing Emma from the collapsing building, then a quieter moment of them in the helicopter processing what's happening and deciding to go after Blake. Then we build to the next big sequence. This rhythm prevents audience fatigue, which can happen in action-heavy films that just pile on spectacle without variation. The use of real-time versus compressed time is also handled well. Some sequences play out in what feels like real time, creating almost unbearable tension as characters race against collapsing structures or rising water. Other sections compress hours or days of travel and searching into montages that keep the story moving. The film is smart about when to slow down and when to speed up. The climactic sequence where Blake is underwater and running out of air is extended to maximize tension. We're feeling every second with her. But the journey from Los Angeles to San Francisco is compressed because the travel itself isn't as important as the moments of character development along the way. This manipulation of time perception is crucial to disaster movie pacing, and San Andreas gets it right more often than not. The film's visual effects were created by multiple companies working in collaboration, which is standard practice for modern blockbusters of this scale. The main vendors included Hydraulx, Cinesite, Image Engine, Scanline VFX, and MPC, among others. Each company typically handled specific sequences or types of effects. For instance, one company might have specialized in the building destruction, while another focused on the water simulations for the tsunami. Coordinating all these different teams to create a consistent visual style requires strong oversight from the visual effects supervisor and the director. The results speak for themselves, while you can tell which elements are CG if you're looking for it. The effects are convincing enough in motion that you're absorbed in the story rather than analyzing the technique. That's the mark of successful visual effects. They serve the narrative rather than calling attention to themselves. The waterwork in particular was a massive technical challenge. Creating realistic-looking water digitally has always been difficult because everyone knows what water looks like and can immediately tell when it's wrong. The tsunami sequence required simulating not just a wave, but an entire city flooding, with water flowing through streets, entering buildings, carrying debris, and interacting with structures in complex ways. The effects teams used fluid dynamic simulations that calculated how water would behave physically, then applied that to the specific geography of San Francisco. They studied footage of real tsunamis, though obviously nothing on the scale shown in the film, to understand how water moves and what it does to urban environments. The combination of digital water and practical water effects, like actually flooding sets and getting actors wet, creates a hybrid that's more convincing than either approach alone would be. The destruction of iconic landmarks required careful planning and execution because these are images that would be burned into the audience's memory. The Golden Gate Bridge destruction in particular needed to feel catastrophic but also beautiful in a terrible way, if that makes sense. The bridge twisting and sections falling into the bay is genuinely stunning visually, even as it's horrifying to watch. The filmmakers chose specific landmarks that would have emotional resonance: the Hollywood sign crumbling, Coit Tower toppling, a T&T park flooded, the financial district collapsing. These aren't just random buildings. They're symbols of the cities being destroyed, and showing their destruction makes the disaster feel more real and impactful. The effects teams modeled these structures in detail, then worked with structural engineers to simulate how they would actually fail under seismic stress, then exaggerated it for dramatic effect because realism only goes so far in a movie like this. The film's color grading shifts noticeably as the disaster progresses, which is a subtle but effective storytelling technique. The early California scenes have warm, saturated colors, lots of golden sunlight and blue skies, everything looking beautiful and inviting. As the earthquakes begin, The color palette becomes more desaturated and cooler, with dust and smoke filtering the light. By the tsunami sequence, we're in this almost monochromatic range of grays and browns, with occasional stark contrast from fires or emergency lights. This visual progression mirrors the tonal shift from ordinary life to catastrophic disaster, helping the audience feel the change in the world these characters inhabit. The final scenes at the refugee camp bring back some warmth and color, suggesting hope and recovery, though the palette is more muted than the opening, acknowledging that things will never be quite the same as they were. One aspect of San Andreas that doesn't get discussed enough is how it handles the aftermath of trauma. Most disaster movies end basically at the moment of survival without dealing with what comes next. And while San Andreas doesn't delve deeply into it either, the refugee camp ending at least acknowledges that survival is just the beginning. These characters have been through something that will mark them forever. Blake will probably have PTSD from drowning and from the entire experience. Ray and Emma will carry survivor's guilt about being able to save Blake when so many others lost family members. The Taylor brothers are foreigners who survived a disaster far from home and will have to process that. The film doesn't explore these psychological impacts in depth, but the performances suggest an awareness of them. The way the characters hold each other at the end isn't just relief. It's people clinging to each other because they know how close they came to losing everything. The ethical question of Ray abandoning his post to save his family is interesting because the film doesn't really treat it as a dilemma. In reality, a rescue worker going rogue to pursue a personal mission while thousands need help would be hugely controversial and probably cost him his job and potentially his freedom. The film hand-waves this by having Ray basically ignore all calls and commands, and while we understand his motivation emotionally, it's worth noting that his choice means other people don't get rescued who might have been saved if he'd stayed at his post. The film chooses to not engage with this moral complexity, probably because it would complicate the narrative and make Ray less purely sympathetic. It's a cheat in some ways, but it's the kind of cheat that disaster movies often make, prioritizing emotional storytelling over realistic consequence. In a more nuanced film, this could have been a source of internal conflict for Ray, but San Andreas keeps the focus on the family reunion mission. The film's treatment of disaster response and emergency services is generally respectful, even if simplified for narrative purposes. We see firefighters, rescue workers, and medical personnel trying to help people under impossible conditions. The military is shown setting up refugee camps and coordinating evacuations. The film doesn't dwell on these efforts because they're not the main story, but they're present in the background, suggesting a wider response to the catastrophe. Real first responders who've seen San Andreas have generally responded positively to the portrayal of their work, even if they note that nobody would really be able to pull off the kind of helicopter rescues Ray manages. The dedication to real rescue workers in the end credits is a nice acknowledgement of the people who actually do this work without superpowers or movie magic to help them. The film's approach to technology and communication during disaster is interesting. We see cell networks go down almost immediately, which is realistic and creates additional challenges for characters trying to find each other. The use of the laser light as a signaling device is a nice low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. Lawrence's earthquake prediction technology is pure science fiction, but it serves the narrative need for someone to understand and explain what's happening. The film doesn't make the mistake of having technology solve problems too easily. The characters have to rely on practical skills and physical courage rather than just calling for help on their phones. This keeps the stakes feeling real and maintains tension that would be dissipated if rescue was just a phone call away. San Andreas works as a showcase for practical problem-solving under pressure, which is oddly satisfying to watch. Blake using her knowledge to create a signal, Ben applying engineering principles to figure out safe routes through damaged buildings, Ray making split-second decisions about helicopter maneuvers, Emma navigating without GPS. These small moments of competence are as entertaining as the big action sequences. There's something deeply appealing about watching capable people use their skills to overcome obstacles, and the film gives us plenty of those moments. It taps into a fantasy that many of us have about whether we'd be able to handle ourselves in a crisis, and it suggests that training, knowledge, and keeping your head can make the difference between survival and catastrophe. The film also works as a reminder of human fragility in the face of natural forces. For all our technological advancement and civilization, we're still vulnerable to the planet itself shifting beneath us. The earthquake doesn't care about human concerns, it's just geology doing what geology does, and we're just along for the ride. There's something humbling about that, and disaster movies at their best capture that sense of human beings confronting forces beyond our control or comprehension. San Andreas shows us cities we think of as permanent and solid being torn apart like paper, reminding us that everything we build is ultimately temporary. It's a sobering thought, but the film balances it with human resilience and our capacity to help each other through catastrophe. The movie's message about family and what really matters is pretty straightforward but effective nonetheless. Material success, professional achievement, even new relationships, all of that falls away when you're fighting for survival. And what remains is the bonds between people who truly love each other. Ray's rescue skills matter less than his determination to reach his daughter. Emma's new life with Daniel is revealed as hollow when compared to her real connection with Ray. Blake's college plans and future ambitions become irrelevant when she's just trying to survive the next hour. The film argues that family, not the biological kind necessarily, but the people you choose to love and protect, is what gives life meaning when everything else is stripped away. It's not a particularly subtle message, but it's one that resonates emotionally, especially in the climactic scenes where the family is reunited. San Andreas also touches on the theme of second chances, both literal and figurative. Ray failed to save one daughter and gets a second chance with Blake. His resuscitation of her after she drowns is obviously a literal second chance at life for her, but metaphorically, it represents the family getting a second chance to heal and be whole. Emma gets a second chance to choose the right partner and commit to working through grief rather than avoiding it. Blake gets a second chance at life and an opportunity to discover her own strength. Even the cities themselves will get second chances. The final images suggest rebuilding and recovery. The film is ultimately optimistic about the human capacity to survive, recover, and even grow stronger through adversity. Whether that's realistic is debatable, but it's an emotionally satisfying message for a summer blockbuster. For all its spectacle and destruction, San Andreas is really a movie about survival and hope. Yes, we watch California get destroyed in spectacular fashion, but we also watch people refusing to give up, risking everything to save strangers and finding strength they didn't know they had. The film's emotional core is about a family finding their way back to each other, which is a story as old as storytelling itself. The earthquake is just the vehicle that forces these characters to confront what they've been avoiding and fight for what really matters. In that sense, the disaster is almost secondary to the human drama, though obviously the disaster is what we bought tickets to see. The film succeeds because it balances both elements, giving us spectacular destruction and genuine emotion in roughly equal measure. Watching San Andreas in a theater when it first came out was an experience because the scale of the destruction really benefits from a big screen and powerful sound system. The rumbling bass of the earthquakes, the crashes of buildings collapsing, the roar of the tsunami, all of it hits different when it's surrounding you in a theater. The IMAX sequences in particular were genuinely impressive on a huge screen, filling your entire field of vision with catastrophic events. Home viewing on even a good system can't quite replicate that visceral impact, though it's still enjoyable. This is the kind of movie that reminds you why theatrical exhibition still matters for certain types of films. You could watch it on your phone, technically, but you'd be missing so much of what makes it work as a spectacle. The rewatch value of San Andreas is surprisingly high for a disaster movie because the character work gives you something to engage with beyond just the spectacle. The first time you watch it, you're caught up in the action and wondering if everyone will survive. On subsequent viewings, you can appreciate the details of the performances, notice foreshadowing and small character moments that pay off later, and just enjoy the craftsmanship of the effects and stunt work. It's comfort food cinema in a weird way. You know how it ends, you know the family survives and reunites, but the journey there remains entertaining. The emotional beats still land even when you know they're coming because the actors sell them effectively. And honestly, sometimes you just want to watch The Rock save people from earthquakes, and San Andreas delivers that experience reliably every time. Comparing San Andreas to other earthquake movies shows how the genre has evolved. The 1974 film Earthquake, starring Charlton Heston, was groundbreaking for its time, using sense-around technology to literally shake the theater and create a physical experience of an earthquake. But the effects, while impressive in the 70s, look dated now, and the story is very much of its. The 90s brought us Dante's Peak and Volcano, which dealt with volcanic disasters, but had similar vibes to earthquake films. Those movies had better effects than the 70s films, but still couldn't achieve the scale and realism that San Andreas manages with 2015 technology. The 2006 Korean film Haeundae depicted a tsunami hitting a beach resort and actually influenced some of the water effects work in San Andreas. What sets San Andreas apart is the sheer scale of destruction it can show convincingly, and its focus on character alongside that spectacle. The film's international appeal makes sense when you consider that earthquakes and natural disasters are universal fears that transcend cultural boundaries. You don't need to understand American culture specifically to relate to a family trying to survive a catastrophe. The themes of parental love, courage in crisis, and human resilience are universal. The spectacular destruction provides visual entertainment that works regardless of language, while the emotional story gives it depth that pure spectacle alone wouldn't have. This combination is why San Andreas worked so well globally. It offered something for everyone. Action fans got incredible disaster sequences, drama fans got a family reconciliation story, and everyone got to see California destroyed in impressively realistic ways. Looking at where disaster movies have gone since San Andreas, there haven't been a ton of similar films that achieved the same level of success. Geostorm in 2017 tried to do global weather disaster, but didn't connect with audiences the same way. Greenland in 2020 took a more grounded approach to disaster, focusing on one family trying to survive a comet strike, and was well received but didn't have the spectacle scale of San Andreas. The disaster genre seems to go through cycles of popularity, and we might be due for another wave of them given how well San Andreas performed. The advancement in visual effects technology since 2015 means that filmmakers could create even more impressive and realistic disaster scenarios now. The question is whether there are stories worth telling using those capabilities. One interesting aspect of San Andreas's legacy is how it may have influenced public awareness about earthquake preparedness. After the film's release, there were reports of increased interest in emergency preparedness kits and earthquake safety information, particularly in California. Whether people actually followed through and prepared is questionable, but at least the conversation was happening. The film includes some genuine safety advice, like the importance of having an emergency plan and knowing how to signal for help, wrapped in the entertainment package. If even a few families had conversations about what they'd do in a real earthquake because of watching San Andreas, that's a positive impact beyond just box office numbers. The film also sparked discussions about infrastructure vulnerability and the importance of building codes. The scenes of older buildings collapsing while newer structures fare better, though still sustain damage, subtly make the point that how we build matters when it comes to seismic safety. Civil engineers and disaster preparedness experts use the film as a jumping-off point for public education, noting what it got right and wrong while emphasizing real earthquake risks. Any piece of popular culture that gets people thinking about legitimate safety issues, even a Hollywood blockbuster, serves a purpose beyond entertainment. For Dwayne Johnson's career trajectory, San Andreas was an important stepping stone that showed he could carry a big-budget, effects-heavy film as the sole lead while also delivering dramatic depth. This likely contributed to him being cast in subsequent projects that required both action credibility and emotional range. The success of the film gave him more leverage in Hollywood and proved his appeal extended beyond the Fast and Furious franchise, where he'd become a major player. Johnson's post-San Andreas career has been remarkably successful, with him becoming arguably the biggest movie star in the world. And while no single film creates that, San Andreas was definitely a significant building block in constructing that status. The behind-the-scenes stories from the production reveal the challenges of making a film of this scale. Coordinating hundreds of crew members across multiple countries, managing the logistics of practical effects and water work, keeping the production on schedule and budget while dealing with the unpredictability of complex stunts and effects work. It's a massive undertaking. Director Brad Peyton has spoken about the challenges of maintaining his creative vision while accommodating the practical realities of big-budget filmmaking, where every decision has financial implications and studio oversight is constant. The fact that the finished film feels coherent and maintains a consistent tone despite being pieced together from elements created by thousands of people in different locations is a testament to strong leadership and clear vision from the top down. The marketing materials and trailers for San Andreas did an excellent job of selling the spectacle without giving away too much of the story. The trailers focused on the massive destruction, Dwayne Johnson's star power, and the basic premise of a father trying to save his family, but they didn't spoil major plot points or the emotional beats. This is harder than it sounds in an era where trailers often show too much and essentially tell you the entire story in condensed form. The San Andreas marketing gave you enough to be excited about seeing it without ruining the experience of actually watching it. The poster imagery of the crumbling California coastline and the tagline, "A Perfect Disaster," communicated exactly what kind of movie this was, setting appropriate expectations. The film's treatment of Los Angeles and San Francisco as characters themselves is worth noting. These cities have such distinct identities and iconic landmarks that showing them being destroyed carries emotional weight beyond just general disaster. Los Angeles with its sprawl, its car culture, Hollywood, the beaches, it's a specific place that millions know well. San Francisco with the Golden Gate Bridge, the hills, the Victorian architecture, the Bay, it's one of America's most visually distinctive cities. The film takes time to establish these places in their normal state before destroying them, making the destruction more impactful. The love for these cities comes through even as we watch them crumble. And the final message about rebuilding suggests that places, like people, can survive catastrophe and come back. Ultimately, San Andreas succeeds because it respects its audience enough to give them both spectacle and substance. It doesn't assume that people who want to see big disaster sequences don't also want to care about characters and feel genuine emotions. It commits fully to being a disaster movie without apologizing for it or trying to be something it's not. The performances are sincere, the effects are spectacular, the emotional beats are earned, and the whole thing is put together with skill and craftsmanship. It's not trying to reinvent cinema or make profound statements about the human condition, though it does say some things about family and resilience that resonate. It's just trying to be a really good disaster movie, and by that measure, it absolutely succeeds. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes a well-executed example of a familiar genre is exactly what you want. And San Andreas delivers that experience with style and heart. To see big disaster sequences don't also want to care about characters and feel genuine emotions. It commits fully to being a disaster movie without apologizing for it or trying to be something it's not. The performances are sincere, the effects are spectacular, the emotional beats are earned, and the whole thing is put together with skill and craftsmanship. It's not trying to reinvent cinema or make profound statements about the human condition, though it does say some things about family and resilience that resonate. It's just trying to be a really good disaster movie, and by that measure, it absolutely succeeds. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes a well-executed example of a familiar genre is exactly what you want. And San Andreas delivers that experience with style and heart.